We have been discussing about this paper, Introduction to Indian Philosophy, which is introduced to our semester 1 students of the UGCF NEP syllabus for the University of Delhi, Department of Philosophy. And we have been talking about the primary readings of Mohanty and A.K before we start with the content of an historical overview of Indian philosophy. Continuing with the primary reading approach to warm up the students about what exactly is Indian philosophy, we continue again with J.N. Mohanty's works further. Again, let me repeat, J.N. Mohanty's work is pertinent so that people, and specifically students who have no initiation to philosophy whatsoever, understands that reading the primary texts is non-negotiable to be a better candidate of being a student of philosophy. This is Professor Ananya Barua from the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College, University of Delhi. Now, Mohanty talks about philosophy and liberation. He had already talked about how there should be refutation of Orientalist misconception that Indian philosophy is only mysticism or religiosity, and he also talks about the meaning of Indian philosophy, which he says that Indian philosophy is not limited to just the geographical space of India and thus claiming it Indian philosophy, not at all. He says that it is an intellectual and cultural matrix of Indian civilization and were articulated in many languages, Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Tamil and other classical languages. He also talks about the refutation of Orientalist misconceptions that Western philosophy is only rational while Indian thought is mystical and irrational. He challenges these, and then he talks about philosophy and liberation. Now, Mohanty explains that most Indian systems connect philosophy with human transformation. Unlike many modern academic approaches where philosophy becomes purely theoretical, Indian philosophy generally links knowledge, conduct, self-understanding and liberation. This connection is expressed through concepts such as Moksha, Nirvana, Kaivalya, Apavagraha. However, Mohanty cautions against oversimplifying this practical orientation. Indian philosophy is not merely religious preaching. Even when liberation is the goal, the route towards liberation is usually deeply philosophical. For example, Buddhists analyze causality and momentariness. Nyaya philosophers construct logical systems. Vedantins investigate consciousness. Jains develop theories of pluralism. Thus, liberation is approached through intellectual inquiry and disciplined reasoning. Mohanty also talks about diversity of Indian philosophical schools. Mohanty emphasizes the extraordinary diversity with Indian philosophy. He distinguishes broadly between Orthodox, the Astic schools, and Heterodox, the Nastic schools. The Orthodox schools or the Astic are the Nyaya, Vaisheshik, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa and Vedanta. The heterodox or the Gnostic schools include Buddhism, Jainism, Charvaka, materialism. Importantly, the Astic does not mean theistic. It refers primarily to acceptance of Vedic authority. This distinction is historically important because many students wrongly assume Astic as a believer in God and Gnostic as atheist. Not at all. Mohanty corrects this misunderstanding too. Mohanty talks about the centrality of debate and dialogue. Another major insight in Mohanty's introduction is that Indian philosophy developed through debate traditions. Indian philosophical systems evolved not in isolation but through criticism, refutation, defense, commentary traditions and public debate. Thus, philosophy in India was fundamentally dialogical. This point is extremely important because it helps students understand why Indian philosophical texts are often structured around objections, Purvapaksha, the replies, Uttarapaksha, and refutations, Khandana. Philosophy emerges through intellectual confrontation, Purvapaksha, Uttarapaksha, Khandan. Mohanty's philosophical method is distinctive because he approaches Indian philosophy not merely historically but philosophically. He avoids romantic glorification. He also avoids civilizational nationalism. He avoids mystical exaggeration, and instead he interprets Indian philosophy as a living philosophical tradition capable of entering into dialogue with phenomenology, with analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, and modern epistemology. This methodological sophistication makes Mohanty particularly important in contemporary Indian philosophy. Now that we have seen about Mohanty's primary work, what is to be expected from this text as and when the students go through, let us now have a look at the other primary readings source, A.K. Werder's work on A Course in Indian Philosophy. The prescribed pages are from page 4 to 11, but a serious student of Indian philosophy should read the entire text if possible. Now, A.K. Werder's introduction is more historical and civilization than Mohanty's. While Mohanty focuses on conceptual clarification, Werder focuses on origins, historical evolution, social background, and development of philosophical systems. Werder attempts to explain how Indian philosophy emerged from the intellectual culture of ancient India. Now, origins of Indian philosophy, Werder traces it to early Vedic culture. He explains that Indian philosophy did not emerge suddenly as abstract speculation. Rather, it developed gradually from ritual traditions, cosmological speculation, religious inquiry, and existential questioning. The Vedic hymns already contain philosophical concerns such as the origin of the universe, the nature of existence, the problem of order or rita, and the mystery of creation. The famous Nashadya Sukta of the Rig Veda is an example of the philosophical questioning emerging within poetic religious discourse. Thus, philosophy originates from reflective inquiry into existence. We also see a transition from ritual to speculation in Werder's work. Werder discusses the movement from ritual-centered Vedic religion to speculative Upanishadic thought. This transition is crucial. The Brahmanas emphasized sacrifice, ritual, performance, priestly authority. But the Upanishads shifted attention towards self-knowledge, ultimate reality, consciousness, and liberation. This marks the beginning of systematic metaphysical reflection in India. Questions emerge such as, what is Atman? What is Brahman? What survives death? What is the relation between consciousness and world? Thus, philosophical inquiry becomes increasingly introspective and metaphysical. Then comes the rise of the systems, the Darshanas. One of Werder's major contributions is explaining how philosophical systems emerged. The word darshan literally means vision, viewpoint, or philosophical perspective. Werder explains that the systems arose through institutional teaching traditions, intellectual debate, doctrinal competition, and textual codification. The rise of systems involved formulation of doctrines, development of technical terminology, organization of philosophical categories, and defense against rival schools. Thus, Indian philosophy became increasingly systematic and scholastic. intellectual climate of ancient India, we see Werder emphasizing that ancient India possessed a highly active intellectual environment. Thinkers constantly debated metaphysics, ethics, knowledge, language, liberation, causality, and reality. This debate culture produced remarkable philosophical sophistication. Importantly, Werder highlights the coexistence of orthodox traditions, skeptics, materialists, Buddhists, Jains, ritualists, and mystics. This plurality created a fertile philosophical atmosphere. We also have the Shramana movements. Werder gives importance to non-Vedic traditions such as Buddhism, Jainism, ascetic movements. These movements challenged Vedic ritualism, priestly authority, and socialist orthodoxy. As a result, Indian philosophy became highly argumentative and self-critical. The interaction between Brahmanical and Shramana traditions is central to understanding Indian intellectual history. Unlike Mohanty, Werder is more historically reconstructive. He tries to situate philosophical developments within social changes, religious developments, institutional contexts, and textual evolution. Thus, his approach is historical, philological, and civilizational. Mohanty, by contrast, is more philosophical and interpretive. Now, if we are to have a comparative importance of Mohanty and Werder, we see that both texts complement one another. Mohanty provides philosophical clarification, conceptual sophistication, defense of Indian philosophy as philosophy, methodological reflections, and Werder provides historical background, rise of systems, civilization development, intellectual history. Together, they help students understand what Indian philosophy is, how it emerged, why systems developed, and how philosophical diversity evolved in India. Now, students by now should especially prepare what is the meaning of Indian philosophy, the features of Indian philosophical systems, differences between Astik and Nastik, relation between philosophy and liberation, rise of Darshanas, Vedic and Upanishadic origins, role of debate and pluralism, and definitely distinction between Mohanty's and Werder's approaches by now should be clear. The readings by Mohanty and Werder together establishes that Indian philosophy is rational yet spiritual, pluralistic yet systematic, practical yet theoretical, and historically dynamic. They challenge the simplistic view that Indian philosophy is merely mystical, a religion, and instead reveal it as one of the world's richest traditions of philosophical inquiry. With this warming up of the primary readings of Mohanty and Werder, we are good to start with the content of our paper, Introduction to Indian Philosophy, Semester 1, and we are starting with the first, which is the historical overview of the origin of Indian philosophy. Now, the question regarding the origin of Indian philosophy is one of the most debated topics in the study of Indian intellectual history. The issue is not merely historical but also philosophical, because the answer depends upon how one understands philosophy, religion, mythology, ritual, rationality, and civilizational itself. The historical view of the origin of Indian philosophy generally attempts to explain when Indian philosophy began, from what intellectual conditions it emerged, how philosophical systems developed, and what social, religious, and cultural forces shaped it. Unlike simplistic accounts that say Indian philosophy began with the Vedas, modern scholarship show that Indian philosophy emerged gradually through ritual speculation, cosmological inquiry, existential questioning, social transformation, intellectual debates, and reactions against orthodoxy. Thus, Indian philosophy did not arise suddenly as a ready-made system. It evolved historically through many stages. Now, philosophy emerges from wonder and existential anxiety. Number one. One historical interpretation maintains that Indian philosophy originated from human wonder, fear, suffering, and curiosity about existence. Primitive human beings encountered death, natural disasters, suffering, birth, dreams, and cosmic mysteries. These experiences generated fundamental questions. What is the origin of the world? What happens after death? Is there a permanent self? What controls nature? Why do human beings suffer? Thus, philosophy originates not as abstract theorizing, but as existential inquiry. This interpretation parallels Aristotle's famous claim that philosophy begins in wonder. However, Indian philosophy differs because existential suffering plays a much greater role than mere curiosity. Indian philosophy is therefore deeply connected with liberation, suffering, and transformation. Now, the famous Nasadiya Sukta, the Rigved 10.129 asks, for example, within quotes, whence this creation came. This hymn is philosophically remarkable because it questions cosmic origins, doubts certainty, and even questions divine knowledge. Thus, early Vedic literature already contains proto-philosophical speculation. The Vedas are not philosophical texts in the later systematic sense. They are poetic, ritualistic, symbolic, and mythological. Therefore, many scholars argue that philosophy had not yet fully emerged in the Vedic age. Instead, philosophical consciousness was still embedded within myth and ritual. Further, from ritualism to speculation. The Brahmanical ritual order, the Brahmanas emphasized on yajna, which is sacrifice, ritual precision, priestly authority, and cosmic maintenance through ritual action. Human beings believed that proper ritual performance sustained social order, cosmic order, prosperity, and divine favor. This period was dominated by ritual formalism, symbolic interpretation, and priestly power. Many historians argue that Indian philosophy partly arose as a reaction against excessive ritualism. The growing dissatisfaction with external ritual, mechanical sacrifice, and priestly dominance led thinkers towards inward reflection. Thus, philosophy emerges partly through critique of ritualism. Then comes the Upanishadic revolution, which is the emergence of philosophical reflection in the Upanishads. The Upanishads represent a decisive turning point in Indian intellectual history. The attention shifts from external sacrifice to inner knowledge. Questions become metaphysical and existential. What is Atman? What is ultimate reality, Brahman? What survives death? What is consciousness? What is liberation? The Upanishadics introduce central philosophical doctrines such as identity of Atman and Brahman, karma, rebirth, liberation, moksha, inner realization. This is the stage where genuine philosophical philosophy clearly emerges. Why? Because inquiry becomes self-conscious, conceptual, reflective, and argumentative. The Upanishads move beyond mythology towards metaphysics. However, the Upanishads still combine intuition, mysticism, symbolism, and philosophical reasoning. Thus, Indian philosophy begins as a fusion rather than a separation of religion and philosophy. Then is the stage of the Shramana movements and the crisis of Vedic authority. The rise of non-Vedic intellectual traditions around the 6th century BCE, India witnessed major intellectual upheaval. New movements emerged: Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivika, Charvaka materialism, and these Shramana traditions challenged Vedic authority, ritual sacrifice, caste hierarchy, metaphysical orthodoxy. This period marks one of the greatest intellectual stages. Now, many modern historians argue that Indian philosophy truly became systematic only during the debate culture. Why? Because rival schools had to defend doctrines, refute opponents, construct arguments, develop epistemology, and formalize logic. Thus, philosophy matured through conflict and pluralism. The sixth stage is the urbanization and social change. Material conditions behind philosophical development. Historical scholars emphasize that philosophy did not arise merely from ideas. Social and economic transformations also played major roles. During the later Vedic age, cities expanded, trade increased, kingdoms grew, social complexity intensified. These changes generated moral uncertainty, political conflict, social mobility, and existential insecurity. As traditional structures weakened, philosophical inquiry intensified. This shows that philosophy is historically conditioned. Indian philosophy was not produced in isolation from society. It was shaped by political structures, social tensions, economic changes, and institutional competition. Then comes the systematization of philosophy, the rise of the darshan, which is the stage 7. Over time, philosophical reflection became systematized into Nyaya, Vaisheshik, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, Vedanta, Buddhism, Jainism. These systems developed technical vocabularies, logical structures, epistemological theories, metaphysical categories. Indian philosophy became increasingly scholastic and rigorous. At this stage, philosophy becomes fully institutionalized. Philosophy is no longer merely spiritual reflection or existential questioning. It becomes systematic inquiry, professional debate, and textual tradition. The phase 8, philosophy emerges through intellectual conflict. One important historical interpretation argues that Indian philosophy developed mainly through debate traditions. Philosophers constantly engaged in Vad, Japa, Vitanda, Purvapaksha, Khandan. Every school evolved through criticism, counter-criticism, and refutation. This challenges the stereotype that Indian philosophy is merely mystical or meditative. Indian philosophy is deeply argumentative. The sophistication of Nyaya's logic, Buddhist epistemology, Navya Nyaya's analysis shows extraordinary rational rigor. Stage 9 is the colonial interpretations of Indian philosophy, where Orientalists' construction of origins, colonial scholars often interpreted Indian philosophy as mystical, irrational, religious, otherworldly. Some argued that India lacked true philosophy because it lacked Greek-style rationalism, secular inquiry, and political philosophy. Modern scholars strongly criticize this view. Thinkers like Mohanty Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, Daya Krishnan argue that Indian philosophy contains rigorous argumentation, skepticism, logic, epistemology, realism, pluralism, and philosophical self-criticism. Thus, colonial interpretations are now regarded as deeply inadequate. Now, some of the modern critical interpretations that might hit someone is questions like, was Indian philosophy always religious? Which could be considered as phase 10. Now, modern scholars debate whether Indian philosophy can be separated from religion. One view says that Indian philosophy is fundamentally spiritual and liberation oriented. Another view says that Indian philosophy includes genuinely secular and rational traditions such as Nyaya, Buddhism, Charvaka. The distinction between philosophy and religion itself is partly Western. In India, metaphysics, ethics, spirituality, epistemology, and liberation often develop together. Thus, Indian philosophy cannot be understood through modern categories alone. The 11th phase has been the philosophical characteristics of early Indian thought. Historically, Indian philosophy developed certain enduring characters like practical orientation, philosophy aimed at transformation and liberation. Number 2, debate tradition. Schools had developed through argumentation. Number 3, pluralism. Many rival systems happily coexisted. Number 4, epistemological concern. Questions of valid knowledge became central. Number 5, soteriological motivation. Liberation remained an important goal. So, this contribution makes Indian philosophy unique, deeply rational, yet existentially transformative. The historical view of the origin of Indian philosophy thus reveals that it might gradually have emerged through myth, ritual, cosmological speculation, existential inquiry, social change, debate culture, and intellectual pluralism. Indian philosophy did not begin as a single unified doctrine. It evolved through centuries of reflection, criticism, and systematic development. Most importantly, Indian philosophy cannot be reduced either to pure religion or abstract rationalism. It is a complex synthesis of reasoning, spirituality, metaphysics, logic, existential concern, and liberation-oriented inquiry. The historical study of Indian philosophy therefore shows not merely the history of ideas, but the evolution of one of humanity's richest intellectual civilizations. Now, what we have noticed by now is that the theme, the historical origin of Indian philosophy, thus is just not merely factual. It is deeply interpretive and philosophical. And one has to be careful when one attempts to answer questions like, did Indian philosophy originate from religion or rational inquiry? It should be that perhaps the most fundamental question regarding the origin of Indian philosophy is the issue concerning whether Indian philosophy began as a theological reflection or as an independent rational inquiry. And the answer determines how Indian philosophy itself is understood. Further, we must also understand that there have been Indian philosophy historically has emerged through an interaction between religious experience and rational reflection. The modern distinction between religion and philosophy is itself largely Western and post-Enlightenment. In ancient India, these domains often overlap. Therefore, Indian philosophy should not be judged by modern secular criteria alone. Similarly, when asked that, why did Indian philosophy become liberation oriented, one must understand that unlike much modern Western philosophy, Indian philosophy consistently links knowledge with liberation, Moksha, Nirvana, Kaivalya. So that is one of the reasons why philosophy is liberation oriented. So these are some of the concerns that as a student of philosophy, specifically dealing with the paper of Introduction to Indian Philosophy, Semester 1, should be engaged in. And please understand, as a student of philosophy, our task is not to provide answers per se. Our task is to question. Our task is to critically engage. As long as we are questioning, as long as our brain is active, as long as we are engaged with philosophical questions, we are being a very good candidate of philosophy. So this has been more or less today's content, where we have introduced Professor Mohanty and A.K. Werder as the sources of primary readings before the warm-up, and we have quickly seen the 9 phases about the historical origin of Indian philosophy, that is, how did it originate. We will be engaging more on this theme in our next class. Thank you so much.